Welcome back, class. We're going to continue moving forward here with Sherry at Social Work PRN. Um, so, a big part of what we do as a social worker is help clients change. Uh, I one time remember my clinical supervisor, Marlis Castile, telling me that the pain of change has to be less than the pain of staying the same. But change is pretty difficult for many people. So, why do you think change is so difficult?
Well, it's funny you say that because one of the things my supervisors taught me about change is that, often people stay where they're at because there's some other need being met, so even though you might have a pattern of behavior that doesn't appear to be helpful to a person, for that person, it's something that
Still
has
may be meeting a need.
meeting an unmet need. And for a lot of us, or for a lot of our clients, not just just I can think of myself. A lot of times, the maladaptive behavior, if you want to call it that, it's a coping mechanism, and it just has helped us get through whatever we're trying to manage or deal with. I think it also is hard to change because the fear of the unknown is scarier sometimes than the
Yeah,
known.
yeah, absolutely.
You know,
And that's loss.
that's
Right.
loss. That's
It's
right.
it's not the loss of like the death of a person, but the loss of control or the
Control,
loss
yeah.
of
Familiarity with the
situation.
situation, yeah.
Can you think of a situation or a client where change was really challenging?
Well, I worked once with a young woman who had developed some eating struggles, anorexia, bulimia behavior, and it was a way to have control in her life, especially during a very difficult time when she was trying to, you know, move from high school to college and had a lot of family things going on. And it was something she learned to just give her a sense of control, and to take that away at that time in her life when she was making so much transition was really hard. I think what we had to work on is helping her understand that those coping patterns were gonna, in the end, hurt her more than they're helping her,
Right, right.
and help her find some other tools to cope and manage those difficult situations. But it took time, a lot of time.
Yeah, that's a very difficult. Um, I think that would be a very difficult case. My experiences with clients with eating issues is that there's usually a lot of moving parts.
Yes.
It isn't just their eating. There are many of other things going
There
on.
usually is. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you very
Yeah.
much. Hey, class, welcome back. We're moving on to section 4, talking about change and why change is so difficult. Um, I sometimes will ask students, I don't know that I ever asked you this when you were my student at UMKC, but I will ask students, who likes to change? And people may raise their hands, may not raise their hands. And the research is really, depending on how you read it, people love to change when change is on their terms. They change where they live, they change their hairstyles, they change their phones, they line up at Apple stores to get the new phones, the new iPads. What they don't like is change that's forced on them. And having been in child welfare for 30 years, and a judge is telling a family how to live or telling parents how to parent, change becomes really difficult at that point because they're not changing because they want to change, because someone's telling them to change. So we've been talking about change with you, looking at your toolkit and the population that you're working with. So why do you think change is so hard?
I think that change, just in the experiences that I've had on personal and professional levels, that change, in a sense, has to be uncomfortable. It has to have a sense of awkwardness that allows you to be able to see the reasons why you're making the change in the first place. Change is also uncomfortable due to your environment. People adhere and get used to your regular set patterns of how you address things, to the point where they also encompass it into their equilibrium. So you can go, for instance, and stay in a mental health hospital, acute psychiatric setting for 3 to 6 days, get medication changes, have therapy, realizes the changes that you need to make, and then you go back into the environment that you were in and realize that your environment is doing their due diligence to try to get you to go back to that,
Absolutely.
even if it's not what you're looking for, even if they are the ones who sent you there to begin with. Your set patterns, either consciously or subconsciously, will want to be comfortable. And I think that people, this is just an opinion, but people are comfortable in misery. So like those forced changes, it's easier for them to stay in those spaces because they know how to navigate those spaces.
Well, and those spaces may be survival skills for them, right?
Absolutely.
So, so even if it's negative, if it's having a negative impact on them, but they're comfortable, then the motivation to change has to outweigh the motivation to stay the same.
Absolutely. Habituation to become habituated to a situation, you have to have dealt with it so often that it just becomes second nature. It's muscle memory. And I think we as human beings get stuck on the aspect that, I really should stop smoking. Yeah, you're picking up a cigarette and you're creating this act and you're doing this without acknowledging it. So
yeah, there was always that. I know when I worked at Shawnee Mission, you'd hear, the doctors talk about, you shouldn't smoke, and then you'd catch the doctors outside smoking, So
a level of ambivalence with it. I
Yeah.
think it's not that we don't know the right thing to do. It's more in the sense of, are we able to get ready to make that change?
And I also love how you touched on environment. In the fall, the students get, inducted into person and environment. They get introduced to the theory. But you're right, you could have all the motivation in the world to change, and then you get back to your environment, and then your environment is going to push you back to that default position, which is counterintuitive to change. So I love how you touched on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, and I spoke at a conference and I quoted myself and I didn't realize I was quoting myself, but it was preparation without contemplation without preparation creates ineffective action. Which means that if you're not preparing for the change and you're just saying I'm going to change something, it's so easy for you with no basis of how you're going to implement that and actually be able to monitor your progress, that you will, any outside interference, even internal interference, will make you go back to that equilibrium of just being right where you're at.
What about change at the macro level at the school district? How is change the same or different than change with your clients here at Children's Mercy?
I mean, to me, it's essentially this. It's on a larger scale, but what you have is traditional paradigms in which schools operate. And although we see the faults in holding those traditional paradigms like zero tolerance policies, going through those stages of change on a macro level tends to be more difficult because you're not just dealing with an individual who knows the changes that they want to make. You're dealing with a system of people who have been immersed in their schooling taught this traditional paradigm, and then for you to actually come in and look at policy and try to add alternative paradigms to create a paradigm shift that will actually be more beneficial, you'll get resistance based on the fact that they're uncomfortable with something that they don't know. And essentially on a micro level, that's exactly what happens to a person, but you're dealing with one individual dealing with their environment. With a macro level, it's kind of like you're one person dealing with the environment and then trying to get the environment to shift.
And certainly there's some huge issues in schools right now. We've got, safety and gun control, school shootings. We've got, the increase in teen suicide. It's just, out of control. Bullying is at an all-time high. Racism is at an all-time, high. It's no longer covert, it's overt, it's all over the place. So dealing with those at that macro level is maybe for me even more challenging because you have less ability to manipulate, any of the paradigms because they're so ingrained at that point.
And it's funny because like you have in our judicial systems where I think I can't remember her name, but out of California, she just was made a Rhodes Scholar for her work regarding restorative practices. And a lot of the West Coast, when it comes to like San Diego, San Francisco, have started implementing restorative practices, not just in their judicial system. In Chicago, they're doing restorative practices. And restorative practices on such a big environment is such a paradigm shift of how to address all those issues. And then we also, like with our district, where racial equity is a huge piece and a part of that, but making sure that people also understand their definitions of words. Equity is often misconstrued with equality. Diversity is often misconstrued with multicultural. It's important that we are able to know the definitions and what these components actually do play into it, because you could say that you're doing restorative practices, but 80% of restorative practices is community engagement. But when you talk about restorative practices and when you talk about education and judicial systems, you're talking about interventions and you're talking about discipline. But that's only part. It addresses discipline so that discipline can work, but the majority of it is community engagement. So you'll have people who are just like, well, we need this for discipline issues, or we need this for bullying or everything else, but not realizing that an actual paradigm shift is not just addressing one thing, but addressing the system as a whole. I think that it becomes very difficult, even as a board director, in talking to administration as well as talking to fellow board members, to help them understand that paradigm shift and why it's needed. And even when they're talking in terms of zero tolerance, not realizing that what they're actually saying.
Yeah, school suspension's a great example. We've got kids taking vaping products to school. Not all the vaping products are, approved vaping products. They were over the counter or, sold at a gas station, which is where you're having all these other, health issues.
Right.
And then zero tolerance is we're doing 180-day school suspensions for a kid who has a vaping product on, instead of maybe educating them about the decision that they're making, because sending them home for 180 days doesn't teach them anything.
Doesn't teach them anything, or doesn't teach the parent anything on how to address issues.
So, and then I would be afraid I'm not a board director, but I'd be afraid that we'd lose some of those kids. They would never make it back after 180-day suspension. And then we've lost that potential. We've lost that opportunity. That was, so.
Yeah.
All right, well, hey, that was a mind-blowing discussion. So,
Yeah.
and we ran, sorry class, we ran way over on that one, but it is what it is. So thank you, Cecil.
Hey, no problem.
Hey, welcome back, class. We're here with Liz. We're going to talk about change and why change is so difficult for our clients and some clients. And the thing which is kind of interesting is that you never know on any given session with a client what you may do, which will plant a seed and facilitate change. So we always plug forward, how many times when you were in foster care case management did you say the same thing to a foster parent or the same thing to a birth mom, and maybe the 30th time that it clicked. So why is change so difficult, do you think?
I think if we think about trying to make changes in our own life, something like changing our diet or exercise patterns, that in and of itself is difficult. But I think when it comes to mental health, we get so stuck in those thoughts, whatever they are, and the automatic thoughts, and it's really hard to combat those. I mean, we know that the brain gets wired, and those negative thoughts, they're stronger in our brain. And so trying to challenge those thoughts and our ways of thinking, and especially if we're in an environment that just continues to reinforce that negative, crummy thought we have about ourselves, or if we're dealing with issues with, you know, depression and we need medication. It can be really difficult to find the right medication. People give up before they find the right one, or they have the wrong diagnosis. They're not
Which they're
getting
getting
the right
the
meds.
right treatment. And I know with your pretty wide, work experience, you've had a lot of involuntary clients, and then you've had some voluntary. Do you see change being different for the voluntary client versus the involuntary client? And I will just clarify for my classmates, the involuntary client in child welfare is the child. They're not there by choice. Frequently it's the parent as well. They're not there by choice. Someone has hotlined them. And so the court is mandating them into therapy, family therapy, individual therapy, a parent aid. So that would be an easy way to define the involuntary client. So do you think that change when you're voluntary versus involuntary?
I mean, I even think a parent who brings their kid in, they could still be an involuntary client because mom and dad are making them do it. But I think with kids, it's been pretty similar, because I found that if I just sit with the kid for an hour, I don't have my phone on me, and the attention is all on them, like that's what they really want. And so to them, I'm not sure that it feels so unwelcomed at a point, especially if you can
Form
do
that
some
alliance,
treatment
and you can engage them.
Yeah.
Then you can work through that barrier of them maybe not wanting to
Yeah.
be there.
But I think when you are working with a child who's working within the court system, who has things going on with their family during visits or changes in their foster home, I mean, there's no stability for them. And so to address some of the behavioral issues that are going on, or some of those negative thoughts they have about themselves, I mean, that change is difficult because there's just always new things popping up for them. And then with adults, I think sometimes when the court is telling them they have to change, that doesn't feel great to them, especially if there's other times in their life where the system tells them they have to be different or act differently, and they just feel like they're always being told that they have to change or be different, and it maybe isn't always respectful of their culture or their upbringing.
Yeah, I remember a case I had where the family had 4, maybe it was 5 Chihuahuas, and the court ordered them to get rid of half of their dogs. And for that family, that was like getting rid of half of their family, because they were part of their family, and it felt pretty disrespectful. It didn't feel respectful of change and change theory. So, all right. Well, thanks. Thank you. Hey class, welcome back. We're in the next section. We're going to talk about change. Change is rough for folks. Why is it so difficult, in your opinion?
Because it's new, it's something different, it's a harder path for people to go down, because what they've already been doing is something comfortable. They know what to expect, even though it's maybe not the greatest thing to expect, but they still know what's going to happen each day.
So what's been the hardest, an example of the hardest client that you've had in regards to change?
Oh man, there's so many. It's hard to think of one.
The one that always comes to my mind that you and I have staffed a few times was the little boy who wasn't transgender, but was certainly questioning, and all the forces kind of against him and against the family system. It made change really a challenge, I think, for that case.
It did. It made it so hard for him. And it was hard because then you have to be at the pace with the family, so they're grieving the loss of their son and him trying to figure out who he wants to be and what that means. And it's also the loss of his life going to be a little bit harder for him. So I think that was kind of setting the tone of, you know, we want change to be fast, of like, let him wear dresses, let him do these things at home. But then the family wasn't quite up to speed with that. So it's just helping them and titrating that out for them.
Yeah. And change, everybody has a different speed for change. And change could be, one of the things I like about EMDR, I remember in my training, a client could be at a spot that they don't want to deal with, and you could encourage them, just press the gas and we'll move on through, or we can apply the brakes and slow down, because everybody has their own speed to change. It isn't I don't get to define.
No, yeah, which
The
is so
theory
true.
of
You,
change.
you see where you want them to go, but then that's not maybe where they want to go.
That's right. That's that whole respecting that self-determination thing.
Yes,
So-
meeting them where they are.
Absolutely, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, class. Hey, class, welcome back. We're here with Amy at A Balanced Mind, private practice in Harrisonville. And we're going to talk a couple minutes about change. Change is a really interesting creature, right? For some people, change can be really easy. Other people, change can be really hard. It is a myth that people hate change, because people change all the time. They change their hairstyles, and they change their cars, and they change their phones. It's just that's change that they want, not change that someone else is telling them to do. So, but by and large, change can be really difficult. With your experience, having worked at psychiatric inpatient and outpatient, having done assessments for such a long time, why do you think change is so hard for people?
Well, in my private practice, I noticed it more, that it was a lot harder for change, because one, I really feel that building a relationship with a client is number one.
Absolutely.
Because if you just try to change them right when they come in, I mean, you're a person in a chair. They have to build respect for you. They have to feel that you know where they're coming from. A lot of times too, in private practice, I find that after they tell me their story, I can see them a little further down the line, and then they can see themselves, because they see themselves as broken and hurting, and I see them as successful and can change and all those good feelings.
Right, from the strengths perspective.
From the strengths perspective,
Right.
yes, and they don't see that yet. So I think that's the part that is hard. It's hard for them to change. It's because they don't see that they can change.
And one of the other things that I think is interesting too, in your practice, having worked, research psych and then, HCA and mobile assessments and all that, you weren't seeing a patient 10 times. You were seeing a patient 1 time, 2 times, except for when you were more on the therapy end at research. And then certainly change frequently doesn't happen in a hospital. It just gets
Right.
them stable so that they can go out into the community, whether it be outpatient or in your case, private practice.
Right.
Now maybe they're more open and ready for change.
Right.
So I'm going to throw you a curveball so that way you're prepared and you can hate me later.
Okay.
Hardest client. Can you think of an example of a really difficult client because change was so difficult? Maybe they couldn't see the change that they've made. And I do, by the way, think that's pretty common. We can see the change that they've made, and people around them can see it, but frequently they don't see it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could just say, that's my entire caseload.
I do have one now that is afraid of the termination process, because she does not see that she has changed incredibly. She's still worried about failing. She still sees herself in the past, but her actions that she's doing currently are way different from when she came into therapy.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk more maybe about that client in the next section, which is termination. But one of the things, and I'll throw this out there and you can tell me you agree or disagree, and then we'll end on this note, but that sometimes change equals loss.
Mm-hmm.
Even giving up a bad behavior is still maybe a loss,
Mm-hmm.
because there's that fear of, what will I replace it with?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that connects to why change is so hard?
Yes, because then it also throws them into a grieving process.
Throws them into a grieving process. That is that's perfect. So
Mhm.
thank you so much, Amy. Appreciate it. Thanks, class. Hey, class, welcome back. We're here with Stacy on our fourth segment, and we're going to talk about change and why change you think is so difficult with clients. And I think I want my students to also remember a client just isn't the person sitting across the table from you, that's also the team you're on, or the department you're in, or the policy or the organization at the macro, meso, or micro level. So, Stacy, why do you think change is so hard for clients?
Well, I've got an analogy that I think may fit. Really, it kind of fits at all of those levels. So if you take the analogy and apply it to those levels. So it's cold in Kansas City right now. It's getting colder than where it has been. And there's white stuff on the ground outside.
Right.
When there's white stuff on the ground outside and it's cold and you're under warm, comfy blankets, what do you want to do?
Well, your instinct tells you to stay inside the warm, comfy blankets.
Yeah, not only your instinct, but sometimes you're like your child, your inner child, your inner adult even. What do you mean adult? I don't want to do that. I'm under these warm, comfy blankets. I don't want to change. I'm just going to stay right here. In fact, I'm just going to pull them over my head and go back to sleep.
And then
No.
subsequently you don't go to work, and then you don't get a paycheck, and you lose, all the other things
Yeah.
that happen down.
So and so, you lay there thinking about those things and you're like, oh crap. Even, and this even applies if you work for yourself. It's, if I don't get up and get to work, then I'm not going to be able to pay the bills. I'm not going to still have this house. I'm not going to, or have somewhere to live. I'm not going to have food in my mouth. I'm not going to be able to make a car payment, whatever. So you whip the covers off, or you rip them off of yourself and go out into the world and adult. But what would happen if you stayed in the bed? If you didn't change? Because what else besides those things of not having your basics, that you need for Maslow, your those are going to go away. What else could happen?
Well, to continue with your analogy, you can develop bed sores if you stay, laying there too long. So,
Mm-hmm. And so
your tissue will die from laying there.
Right. So if you think about that from a larger standpoint, if let's say it's a team that doesn't change, and there's a sore that starts because they haven't changed,
right.
And that sore gets bigger and bigger. What happens with that team? Ultimately, does it cause additional issues? Or if you just even think of, or if you think of policy that doesn't get changed that needs to, what happens later? If we think about our things like mental health policy.
Right.
And you look at that over the span of 20, 30, 40 years, what has happened if we haven't been able to actually take care of people is we've gotten ourselves now in a mess where it's even harder, and it's going to be even harder to get us out of that mess.
It's funny you say that, Stacy. When I left Gillis in 1996, I would have to say the biggest problem systemically in the organization was communication and transparency. So I leave, I return exactly 10 years later in 2006. In 2006, when I left in 1996, we were just getting voicemail, and we used to get messages on these little pink pads, and they would be in your mailbox. When I returned in 2006, there's email, there's texting, there's all these other ways to communicate. And what's the number one problem still at the Gillis Center in 2006? Communication.
Transparency.
And even though the players changed, the problems within the agency, those sores never were dealt with. And so subsequently, communication still became a problem even 10 years later. So
even with all the tools you had.
Even with all the tools.
You can have the biggest technology toolbox in the world and know how to use it. And let's say that for some magical reason, your agency also knew how to use it. Then, and still not have communication and transparency.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you, Stacy. This was a great segment. I appreciate it. I know my students are appreciating it. So appreciate it. We're gonna sign off, and we'll be right back.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey class, welcome back. We're here with Lindy, Avila University. We're going to talk about change. That's an amazing testament. 35 years as a social worker. That's an incredible, honorable career and path. You've seen a lot of change. You've seen probably a lot of clients fight change, change forced upon them when that we know that doesn't work.
Right.
So why do you think change is so hard for the work that we do, whether it's at the macro level or the micro level?
Yeah, I think it's just change is hard, period. I think it's just part of the process. I think that, if we go back to systems theory, systems seek homeostasis and, reach that point of balance and balance.
Right.
Homeostasis. And so to move off of that is uncomfortable because we like what's comfortable, what's familiar. And so I think that it just is the nature of the beast that once people start to explore change, it gets scary. And so, to me, I do think pain is a huge motivator for change. And so at the point we see a lot of clients, that pain has gotten extreme.
Right.
And that is the motivator often, with some guidance to start making changes. As they get less pain, then that motivation drops off a little bit. And so the next crisis that comes along, there is a natural resistance to, staying in the uncomfortable place with the uncomfortable situation. And people kind of have to consider, do I want to change back? Do I want to go back to what I knew? And we all go back, one step forward, two steps back. It's just part of the nature of how we are as people.
Absolutely.
So I don't think it's unusual. I predict it to all my clients. I mean, before we even talk about things to try, we talk about, there's going to come a point, where you're telling me today things are good, but then 2 weeks later you're going to come in and say none of this worked. And I'm going to remind you of the, when it was good, but it is going to be normal to come in and doubt it. So I think that resistance is just part of it.
I encourage my students to avoid the use, when we're thinking about change, of words like manipulation, denial, treatment resistant.
Yeah.
Because those really are words that are going to prevent change from ever occurring.
Right.
And when as a young, when our children got braces, and they're so excited when they all come off, but they're not really done with the orthodontist, because then I would always say to clients, using this as a metaphor, what comes next? And then they would say the retainer. Yes, the retainer. Because if you don't have the retainer, all the change your teeth made, they'll just slide right back.
Exactly.
So why would we get mad at a client when they slide back, yet it's part of human nature for things to slide back.
Yeah. And
so
I
we
think
have to
that's-
put little retainers in place to
Yeah.
keep those change, to make them permanent.
Absolutely, and I think that's where supervision comes in to help make sure we've done that part of the plan change process. We talked about client maintenance, how they're going to maintain that, and I do think it is easy, again, if the client comes in and is angry with you because it doesn't seem like anything changed, and you don't have that supervisor to go to, you can feel really stuck, and it's common then to blame
The client,
to blame
right,
the client. Well, it's a bad client. They're not willing to change. They never wanted to change anyway. And I think we just have to constantly be reminded. And I like motivational interviewing for that, because it puts it back on me to know, well, this client's at this stage of change. My job is to help them advance, so they do get to the point they're contemplating it or taking action.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that those are really important considerations. So, thank you so much, Lindy.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, class. Thank you for being here with us.
Wow.
Hey, class. Welcome back. We're here with a social worker who works in the VA and a social worker who is a veteran but works at the United Way. Tomas and Athena. So why is change so difficult? How do you guys think change is so difficult?
Well, I know from our conversations, Gray, that you've said people tend to forget when they make changes. So I would definitely agree with that.
Absolutely,
We
they
forget.
can't forget.
We forget. And I think it just takes a lot of perseverance, courage. Also, not being afraid of failure, and obviously, with fear. So with those things, it's hard to make change and continue to make change.
In fact, I would say this, class, first off, it's okay to fail with a client. Not fail to the point where you've hurt them, but failure that you had to shift gears, you had to try something new. But if you're going to fail early in your relationship with the client rather than working with them 10 months and then you realize that you weren't helping. It's better to fail early a little bit. So what about you? What do you think about change?
I think that change is difficult because it causes us to it's the core, something that's within the core that needs to be shifted. And it does take, like Tomas says, courage and perseverance and not being afraid to fail, because sometimes you do fail. And I think that's growth. It's not to say, I am a failure. It says that I'm growing, and it doesn't feel good, but it's good for me. And it's going to be good for other people that are around me. It's going to make me a better person. And I think that I've seen people that have not wanted to change. I've been one that have not wanted to change until I'm confronted by those that are in my sphere of influence that have come up to me and said gently, you need to make an adjustment in that area of your life. In other words, you need to change. And so that's where I am today.
Absolutely. Sometimes change is painful,
Yes,
but the pain of change has to be less than the pain of staying the same
it really does.
in order for change to occur. But sometimes change is what we call first order and then second order change. First order change is reversible. A lot of our clients make first order change. They'll make little tweaks, kind of like the metaphor of having braces. When you get your braces off, then you get a retainer, because otherwise your teeth will go back to the way they were. The retainer makes it second order change, but without the retainer, it's just first order change, and it will shift back. Where second order change is more permanent change. So, all right. Well, thanks class. Thanks guys. Appreciate it.